with dermatoscopic features of melanomas on sun-damaged skin. So why are these particular melanomas so difficult to diagnose? Number one, they often resemble other lesions. So most typically, lentigo, pigmented actinic keratosis, pigmented lichenoid keratosis, sometimes macular separated keratosis, and sometimes reticular nevus. Second is that they change very slowly. And so patients will often say, no, I've had this for many, many years, it can't be melanoma. The third is that the dermatoscopic features are often very subtle in early lesions. In late lesions, everyone can recognize them, but in early lesions, they're very difficult to identify. So this is an example highlighting those three characteristics. So at baseline, this particular lady had two lesions here. The first lesion, the one on top that's darker, is the one that stands out. And in fact, her dermatologist biopsied that, and that was benign, that was a lentigo, nothing to worry about. But she also had this other lesion here that wasn't so concerning at that time. 6 years later, it had changed to this point, and this is when I first met her. And at this point, it's obvious this is a lesion that needs to be carefully examined. Let's take a look at the dermoscopy. You don't see too many colors, you don't see too many structures. So people who aren't very familiar with melanomas on sun-damaged skin may initially say this doesn't look so concerning. But with practice, you would recognize the important features here. So what are the clinical clues to the diagnosis? So number one, they often are outlier lesions. As we heard earlier, they tend to be ugly duckling lesions, so they stand out in the context of the patient. So any patient that has a lot of signs of chronic sun damage, meaning many solar lentigines or actinic keratoses, the first thing I do is I take a step back from the patient in order to get a good look at their whole body to identify what are the lesions that stand out the most. They also tend to be quite broad when they're first discovered. Obviously, when they're early, they're much smaller, but very difficult to distinguish from other lesions. So here's some clinical examples of how these are outlier lesions. So on the arm, this lady's had a lot of sun in her life, she has a lot of solar lentigines. This is a clear outlier. Another lady, a lot of solar lentigines, some nevi, clear-cut outlier. Another lady, clear-cut outlier. This is a gentleman, an outlier of the background of his skin, also on the forearm. So clinically, they tend to catch your eye, and the clinical appearance for me is very important. I always put that in the context of the dermoscopy. What are the most important dermoscopic clues? For me, in my opinion, number one is granularity or peppering, which is one form of regression. And these are fine blue-gray dots that often have a dust-like appearance. The second, as we heard from Dr. Jaimes, are angulated lines. And these can form many different variations, and there are multiple subtypes that I'll show you in a second. So multiple terms have been used: zigzag, geometric shapes, to essentially describe the same structure. So here's an example of the regression. We blow up that area. Very fine dust-like appearance, this kind of grayish, bluish appearance. Here's an example that Dr. Jaime showed earlier, the best example I've ever seen of the angulated lines from Dr. Rabinovitz. You can see many fine lines here. This is the variation of angulated lines that you will hear most frequently. But in my experience, I've seen other variations. So here I would also say you have angulated lines that form these polygons or geometric shapes, but they're not composed of the same kind of fine appearance of a brownish line. Sometimes they're the appearance of the regression or the dots or globules, but they often have that same geometric appearance when you take a look at the lesion stepping back. Another variation is when there's a contrast between a darker area and a lighter area that can form the same sort of geometric shapes or rhomboid structures. These aren't as well accepted in the literature as being the same thing, but for practical purposes, I find them to be useful for melanomas on sun-damaged skin. Now, the best study that's examined this is from Dr. Jaimes here from Colombia. She she confirmed that the most common features that you see are the granularity or peppering and angulated lines. She also went further and sort of categorized these melanomas into 3 schematics or subtypes to sort of help understand the most common appearance. And those are divided into patchy peripheral pigmented islands, angulated lines, that's the only feature that you see, and tan structureless or granularity pattern. So we'll go through a couple examples. The first is this patchy peripheral islands. So you see large lesion. At the periphery, you see a little bit of network here, a little bit of network here, a little bit here, but it's not all confluent together. So a common appearance of these particular melanomas. You also see some other features, right? There are some angulated lines here that form geometric structures. You do see some regression. Another example, patchy area here, patchy area here, and then between them you see areas there is no pigmentation or network. Another example that for me would be very subtle on dermoscopy, but you see these patchy areas. You may think this looks somewhat like a reticular nevus. Last example from Dr. Brown, same appearance. So the second pattern are the angulated line pattern. So this is where really the only structure that you see are the angulated lines. And typically you see them so pronounced in very broad advanced lesions in my experience. This is a smaller lesion, but again you see mostly angulated lines. You see pigmentation, but it doesn't really form any other structure in the lesion. So what are these angulated lines? There really aren't very good studies that have examined sensitivity, specificity. In my experience, I tend to see them in melanomas, but I'm sure there's some bias in that. And to date, we still don't really understand what is the histopathology correlation. There was a recent publication earlier this year in JAMA Dermatology. They reported a few lesions that they had monitored over time. And you can see from the baseline to the follow-up, you can see many more angulated lines appearing. And they correlated that with some histopathology. What were their findings? Basically, they were able to say that the lines that they see correlated with nests of melanocytes, but it still doesn't explain why these structures occur. And so I remain interested in whether someone can figure this out. Now, not all lesions, the angulated lines will become more prominent, or will you get more angulated lines over time. This is an example from one of my colleagues in the clinic who inadvertently followed this melanoma over time. And you can see at the baseline, you see more angulated lines, but over time actually they become less prominent. And so in a way, it's not always so clear-cut as you would imagine in terms of tumor progression. The third pattern is the tan structureless and granularity pattern. So these are lesions where you see some tan pigment, but the primary structure is the regression. So you see that fine blue-gray granularity, dust-like appearance, and that's the clue to the diagnosis. Another example where, in my experience, it's a little bit coarser, not quite as fine as the previous example. Third example, where really you just see the regression throughout the lesion. And the differential diagnosis that this particular presentation raises is pigmented lichenoid keratosis. And I'll just briefly discuss that. There's an entity known as lichenoid keratosis like melanoma. So these melanomas and sun-damaged skin that look very much like pigmented lichenoid keratosis. They tend to be quite subtle. In clinical appearance, they may have a slight gray color. On dermoscopy, you really just see some very fine regression, but these are melanomas. So I'm quite careful in lesions that I think may be lichenoid keratosis. I do tend to biopsy them to confirm that diagnosis. So what are some of the other dermoscopic features that you can see in melanoma on sun-damaged skin? So we'll go through a couple. So scar-like areas, this is another one that I find to be very useful, but I often find beginners will call almost everything scar-like pigmentation. So for me, it really has to be quite white in color and much whiter than the surrounding skin.